As good as the Miami Grand Prix was from time to time during the afternoon, I can't remember the last time there was a race in which the radio transmissions were actually better than the action on track. Of course, the Oscar, excuse the pun here, should go to Ferrari, who put on a great imitation of themselves. But honourable mentions should also go to Carlos Sainz of the Williams-Mercedes team and to Max Verstappen at Red Bull Honda. But first, the news. The news, of course, is that McLaren finished 1-2, a dominant win in the end, with a car that was, well, as we saw throughout the weekend, demonstrably quicker than anything else we saw at the Miami venue. But it wasn't easy for them because, as we saw yesterday, Max Verstappen took a brilliant pole position. As I said at the end of the video last night, Max's only real chance of winning the race on Sunday, bearing in mind the tiny sweet spot he has for operating the tyres on that car compared with the McLaren drivers, the only chance he was going to have would be if the weather intervened. And it tried hard. In the morning, there were plenty of warnings about thunderstorms coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. And in addition to that, the FIA put out, first time I've ever seen it, the procedure that Formula One should follow in the event of lightning. And I thought it was all going to be, if you're following another car and it gets struck by lightning, do this, or if you see some fork lightning there, make sure you go there because this is conductive, that isn't. But it wasn't any of that stuff. It was all about regulatory things to do in the garage and what changes you could make to the car in the pit lane or in the garage. All quite boring stuff, actually. But anyway, there they were thinking about thunderstorms, potential lightning, but none of that happened. There were 1 or 2 drops of rain, completely inconsequential. So Max Verstappen was basically faced with a dry race. Everybody except George Russell and Lewis Hamilton started on the medium tyre. It was a one-stop strategy, medium and then to hard. And Max on the pole made a pretty good start, but Lando Norris on his right, on the inside, made a very, very good start. As I said a few videos ago, who says Lando doesn't make great starts? So there he is down the inside. But I don't think it was that. I think Max just made his own mistake. He just outbraked himself, went a little bit too deep. Maybe the tyres weren't properly up to temperature. Again, probably easier to get the tyres into the sweet spot on the McLaren compared with the Red Bull. Max locked up, ran wide, and there's Lando down the inside. And it looked for all the world as if he was going to get the lead here. But the problem for Lando is that at Miami, yes, it's a relatively tight right-hander, but then you're accelerating out of that through a left-hander. And of course, even though he was on the outside of the right-hander, Max was lined up perfectly for the inside going into the left. And there was Lando now effectively on the outside, but alongside him. And all Max had to do was just back off a fraction and Lando would have got the lead. But Max Verstappen's never going to do that for Lando Norris. He just stayed on the racing line, used probably a little bit more road than he should have, knowing that Lando was there. And Lando had no alternative but to go off track and lose 2 or 3 places. And I think here, a little bit like Max should have given the position back in Saudi Arabia, and we would have had a different evening there. I think in this occasion, it was pretty obvious that Max was going to do that. I don't think Lando read Max very well. And had he just backed off slightly there, let Max take that position, filed in behind him, Lando would still have been second. But much more importantly, he would have been in front of Oscar Piastri and he probably would have won the race. So easy to say, oh, well, Lando blew it there. But the reality is you've got to read the character of the individual that you're racing against. And as we saw later in the race, about 15, 20 laps later, when Lando was trying to get past Max now to get up to P2, he dropped 3 or 4 places. He got past the Williams, he got past the Mercedes very easily, and he quickly caught Max. But with the tyres now hot and the McLaren in much better shape than the Red Bull, Lando took too long to pass Max. Maybe it was because he was a bit daunted by what had happened out of that first corner, but I think it was more just Lando is a little bit messy, well, very messy when it comes to traffic. Oscar Piastri got past Max Verstappen, absolutely no problem, took him 2 laps, bang, he was gone. Actually, he induced Max into his second mistake of the race. The first was obviously at the first corner, and it was at that same corner with Oscar having got the DRS on the pit straight, 3 DRS zones in Miami. He was down the inside and Max just braked a little bit too hard again, ran wide, and Oscar took the lead. Very, very simple. But Max made no mistakes. Obviously, when Lando Norris was behind him, he didn't feel the pressure. And at one point, Lando did get past at the second straight DRS, but then ran wide off track and had to give the position back to Max at the next straight, and then had to repass him. The whole thing was very messy. And by the time Lando got past Max, to make it a McLaren 1-2, Oscar Piastri, and then Lando Norris, he was 9 seconds behind Oscar Piastri. So thank you and good night. Now, it's easy for me to say all of that because one other thing should be mentioned from the start of the race, and that is Kimi Antonelli. Just superb again. We saw how good he was on Friday. We saw how good he was yesterday. This guy's getting better and better all the time. So when this incident happened with Lando Norris, there's Kimi, bang, straight past him and pushing Max like crazy going down through turns 5, 6 and 7, almost getting the lead going into 7. But Max just held the position and then gradually pulled away from Kimi Antonelli. And Oscar Piastri had to work very hard for 2 or 3 laps to get past Kimi. Very impressive drive by Kimi Antonelli. Sadly, and I'm going to have to jump ahead now because it's quite a complicated race, but sadly for Kimi, it didn't pan out as well as it should have, because Mercedes brought him in relatively early to try to get the undercut on Max Verstappen. Max responded the following lap, so it didn't pay off. He came out ahead of Antonelli. But that meant because of a virtual safety car, which was instigated a couple of laps later, George Russell had the benefit of a VSC to come in for his pit stop, and he easily got past Kimi that way. And then all of a sudden, he got past Max as well. So all of a sudden, it was George Russell up in P3. And Kimi Antonelli, in addition, had dropped behind Alex Albon in the Williams, a position he was never able to get back. So it didn't end that well for Kimi, but he will be able to leave Miami feeling incredibly confident and happy with the way things have gone. Anyway, back to the front of the race. Got to say, the McLaren MCL 39, just in a class of its own, basically a second a lap quicker than any other car out there. You know, obviously taking tyres into account, but on all levels of fuel, the McLaren was just the class car. More dominant in Miami than it's been at any race so far this year. And Oscar Piastri, just superb. Yes, Lando Norris set fastest lap and reduced that 9-second gap down to 4 seconds or something towards the end. But that was just Oscar looking after the tyres, looking after the fuel, looking after everything, just making sure that there were no issues. That was not Oscar Piastri on the limit by any means. And Lando Norris, of course, in finishing second, will think, well, not a bad weekend, the way things have been going recently. I won the sprint race, admittedly by default. I was quicker than Oscar in qualifying. I was on the front row, and had Max not taken me off or whatever, and Max didn't get the penalty. Obviously, Lando had been on the radio saying that Max had taken him out, pushed him off. Then he could have won that race. I think, as I say, I think he should have read what Max was going to do, and it's pretty clear what Max was going to do. He should have just backed off, given him the position, filed into P2, and then he would have won that race. There's no way Oscar Piastri would have beaten Lando Norris had Lando had track position. But that was it. The minute he was behind Oscar, it was all over. All the radio stuff really began with Max Verstappen's description of what it was like driving that Red Bull RB21 when he was fighting with Lando, fighting with Oscar. And he said it was just super slippery everywhere, which kind of, you can understand what he means by that. The thing was just sliding everywhere with no grip. But he didn't look like that on track, but that's obviously what he was feeling. And then he said, the brakes are terrible as well, which is a function, of course, of the tyres going off and general lack of grip anyway. Probably not the brakes per se. And so, again, everything that happened today puts the quality of Max's pole lap yesterday into its true perspective. Astounding that he got the pole in a Red Bull that was not as good as a Mercedes in the race, let alone as good as the 2 McLaren Mercedes. Just an outstanding qualifying lap, and Max Verstappen eventually finished 4th. Unable to do anything about George, who was on the medium tyres at the end. Max is on the hard. The only hope then was that, because the rain wasn't going to come, the only hope was that the medium might go off towards the end. But they didn't. They did on Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari, but they didn't on George's car. He was in clean air from the minute he had them. And he was able to look after them and drove beautifully. Max never even got within DRS range. But having said that, he always kept it within about 2.3 seconds. Sometimes it came down to about 1.2, but it was never, ever going to be on without DRS. And he never got in range of DRS. Towards the end of the race, there was another great radio bit when Red Bull said to Max, make sure you finish within 5 seconds of George. Now, earlier in the race, Max, when he was behind George, he'd said, George didn't slow for the yellow. Mate, report that, or something like that. And no doubt Red Bull did their best. And because no decision had been taken about anything to do with the yellow, and as I'm doing this video now, I haven't seen any talk yet. There may well be. Watch this space, I guess. But on the second last lap, they said to Max, don't back off, Max. Stay within 5 seconds of George, which is obviously Red Bull just quite good thinking, making sure that if George did get the penalty, that Max would then get P3. And Max replied, why do I have to do that? No, don't worry, Max. We'll talk about it after the race. You can see how excited he was on the radio. Anyway, let's move on to Ferrari, who were absolutely pathetic today. I don't know whether it's a function of how ugly their car looks in that livery, that HP livery. It's just terrible. I talked about it yesterday. I don't know why, but it looked even worse today. I don't know if it was the light or the angle of the sun or whatever it was, but the white wheels and the whole thing just looked absolutely horrendous. Don't know what they're thinking. if that's what you got to do to the car to keep your sponsor happy, probably better in Ferrari's case. They don't need the money anyway, do they? Probably not to have the sponsor, just have the red car. Anyway, it all started because they're on different strategies. And Charles, starting on the medium tyre, didn't have a great first part of the race. And Lewis was even worse on the hard tyre, so they were nowhere really. But when they switched tyres, Lewis suddenly on the medium tyre was catching Charles, and there was something like P6, P7 to fight for. It was going to be difficult for them to do anything about the Mercedes, either Mercedes or Alex Albon, let alone Max Verstappen. But nonetheless, Ferrari wanted to put on a good show. And so there's Lewis starts to catch Charles Leclerc, and he's catching him and gets on the radio and says, I'm getting held up now. My tyres are getting hot. Come on, what are we going to do, guys? And they say, oh, we'll get back to you, Lewis. Nothing happens. Lewis says something like, you guys having tea or what? And eventually they tell Charles to let Lewis pass. And it takes a lap or two for Charles to sort of eventually do that, begrudgingly. And then Charles comes out with the absolute classic, having let Lewis pass, and says, tell Lewis to go faster. My tyres are getting too hot. You can't please these guys, can you? You've got DRS if you're behind the guy, but if you're behind the guy, the tyres are going to get too hot. Anyway, so it went on. And of course, the problem then was that Lewis's tyres had got quite hot, and he wasn't that quick, having got past Charles. Very embarrassing situation for Lewis, really. He was going about as quick. No, he was about 3/10 slower than George everywhere, and not on track position, but just, that was when they were on free air. He couldn't get anywhere near George's lap times on the same tyre. Anyway, Charles then says towards the end of the race, how near are we to Kimi Antonelli? Because I'm getting held up now. I could maybe get Kimi. Ferrari then come back and say, okay, if you're in free air, Charles, how quickly do you think you can go? I mean, I've never heard a race engineer say that to a driver in the middle of a race. How quickly do you think you can go if you're in free air? Of course, Charles says, I have no idea, but let's give it a go. So then they tell Lewis to give position back to Charles. I'm smiling here because it was quite funny, really. I mean, you've got to say it was funny because we're not talking about the lead here. It was, 8th, 9th place they were doing. It was ridiculous. But I guess anyway, watching it, you could say, well, it's the Ferraris. They're stars of the show, whatever. So anyway, Lewis eventually moves past and gives Charles the position back again. And Charles says, right, let's see what we can do about Kimi Antonelli now. See if I can catch him. And he did quite well. I mean, Kimi was backing off towards the end, and he didn't pass Kimi, but he got pretty close to him, got within about a second at the end of the race. But then the whole Marx Brothers thing continued, because then Lewis's engineer, Lewis obviously at this point is absolutely furious. And they say to Lewis, oh, Lewis, Carlos Sainz is only 4.2 seconds behind you in the Williams. And of course, he can see a little bit of blue in his mirrors anyway. So Lewis gets back on the radio, says, okay, do you want me to let him pass as well? So it went on. I mean, need I say more? And bear in mind, this is Carlos Sainz as well. Think about the irony of all this. Alex Albon, long gone, destroyed both Ferraris. Williams beat Ferrari, easy. But Carlos Sainz wasn't far away either. Catching them big time, catching Lewis big time. And this is the guy that basically was fired and he was replaced by Lewis. And here he is catching both Ferraris, and already Williams are giving them a hard time. So it was all quite nerve-wracking. And then going into the last corner, well, it wasn't the last corner, at the end of the long back straight on the last lap, Carlos is in DRS behind Lewis, and Carlos has the run, has the momentum, goes down the inside of Lewis, and Lewis just goes straight across, and they touch like this, and bang, bang, bang. It looked like some sort of, B-rated Hollywood movie. And they go like this, and eventually Lewis just sort of staggers across the line ahead of Carlos Sainz. And Carlos on the slowdown lap with that deep voice of his says, I think Lewis moved quite a lot under braking. Understatement of the day there, Carlos. Just amazing stuff brought to life by the radio. So let's just go through the results, because it's probably a bit all over the place, this video, because it was that sort of race. Lots going on. No actual safety car interventions, just all virtual safety car stuff. So that was probably a good thing, I guess. So Oscar Piastri, Lando, Norris finished 33 seconds ahead of the opposition. I mean, and they didn't lead from the start. They were held up quite a lot by Max, and in Lando's case, he had to pass 3 or 4 cars, and they still beat the opposition by 33 seconds. Lando set fastest lap. Oscar Piastri dominated the race for yet another win. 3rd win for McLaren this year. I mean, it's looking a bit ridiculous, isn't it? It's just unbelievable how well he's driving and how well he's doing. Then 33 seconds behind, George Russell beat Max Verstappen by about 2 seconds. Maybe there'll be some sort of penalty. Unlikely, I suspect, but maybe there will be. And then 8 seconds behind them, a brilliant Alex Albon in the Williams-Mercedes. Pretty much forgotten by the TV cameras and the director because he was doing such a good job and he had that space either side of him. Really, really good driver, Alex Albon. Ahead of Kimi Antonelli, who just beat Charles Leclerc, who just beat Lewis Hamilton, who just beat Carlos Sainz. And that was, of course, where the TV was focused. And it was all quite good stuff. That was Ferrari, Williams, as I said. So yeah, an amazing day at the races. And I think, the sad thing is, I've been saying this for so long now, that what we really want to see is all the stuff that happens when they get out of the car and if they've done all the interviews or whatever, and then they get into the team briefing room. I would love to be in the Ferrari one when Charles and Lewis are there talking to the engineers, talking to the top brass about how that race went. And the ridiculous thing is, all the discussion will be about, oh, you did this and you kept me out there for I should have passed him there. Of course, it was all meaningless because the reality is the cars were absolutely terrible anyway, and they looked terrible. So forget Miami Ferrari. It was just a weekend to forget. But in our case, we won't forget it because we'll be doing some live streams and some cam chat very soon, no doubt. So big thank you to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja, and of course to RAC Watches, the newest of our partners, a brilliant new Danish company that combines pin-sharp technology with a genuine love of motor racing heritage. You can buy one of the GT40 watches, all of which contain materials from the original cars raced in the 1960s from the Shelby American, Essex Wire and Sid Taylor racing teams, by following the link in the description below this video. And there's also a 20% discount you can claim if you use the code PETERGT40. So that was the Miami weekend. Thanks for joining us. As I say, lots of chat coming up. Take care. See you soon.